Hello and welcome to Veterans of the Valley. I'm Tom Turbyville. Captain Yolanda Kozlowski witnessed much of World War II working under a Red Cross tent, a triage nurse for the 100th Evacuation Hospital, attached to General Patton's Third Army, marching through France and Belgium on to Germany. Her memories of the war are those of good times and the saddest times. One of those good times was when then Yolanda Frisch met the young aviator, Ed Kozlowski, 4 days after D-Day. That was a meeting that resulted in what has now been a 60-year marriage. We welcome Captain Yolanda Kozlowski to Veterans of the Valley. Welcome, Yolanda, and thank you first off for your service. Let's go back to when you first decided to get into the military and get into the service, and it was something that your father was not real in favor of, so you had to sort of make him a promise, but eventually you got into the service. Sort of take us back to that time.
Well, I promised my father, I talked to him about joining the Army, and he said he wanted me to wait 1 year to make sure that that's what I wanted to do. So I became a superintendent of nurses for a hospital in Charleston, West Virginia.
Right.
I worked a year, and I still hadn't changed my mind, and I went to the Army and applied to get into the Army.
Right.
And I was told in a nice way that I had only limited service in the United States.
Right, you had flat feet.
Yes, I had flat feet and I had an eyesight deficiency. And so I said, well, okay, I'll take that chance. And I was assigned to Fletcher General Hospital in Cambridge, Ohio.
Right.
And
that was an assignment you didn't like very much.
Well, I was very upset, to put it mildly. Anyway, I went into the Army at the time they were changing from blues to khaki. Mm-hmm. And of course, the Army said, we will furnish you with everything you need. So I waited for the Army to furnish me. And in the meantime, I wore civilian clothes, which did not set very well with the superintendent of nurses at Fletcher General. And she kept asking me if I was going to buy it, and I said no, that the Army said they would furnish me everything, and I said I'm waiting till they furnish me everything I need. And finally, I broke down and did buy some things, but at that time, they were changing from blue to khaki, so I didn't want to invest a whole lot of money into blue, which I wouldn't use again.
Right.
And so finally, we got into the khakis. And I was assigned to Fletcher General Hospital, which made me very unhappy. And so I decided, well, we'll see what we can do. And I didn't exactly break rules, but I bent them.
Right.
And of course, after I bent several rules, the chief nurse decided that I should be put on a detail, a group that was going to Camp Dix. And so we went there, and I was assigned to the 100th Evac, which
Right.
was what I wanted to do anyway. And I was going overseas.
That was your ticket overseas.
And we kept saying, please, let us go to Europe. Don't go to Pacific. Let's go to Europe. And everyone was there because nobody knew exactly where we were going to go until we were on the water.
Right.
And then they opened the orders, and that's where we went.
Yeah.
And of course, we had winter clothes and summer clothes, and so we were prepared for both places. We landed at Swansea, England, on February the 14th.
Right.
And from there, we went to Fleetwood, England, and our unit, which consists of over 300 people, the hospital there, was assigned to a to a hotel, and they also had places for the enlisted people, which they lived in an area where the fishermen came in and out. And so we were told that we should prepare for D-Day.
Right.
And as we did, we spent our time, which seems probably funny to people now, but we spent our times making packages of gauze and rollers of bandages and so forth, and putting them in trunks that we could have at each area. And so we did this for our spare time, and plus that time, we were allowed to go off on weekends. And I took every weekend off and went somewhere in England.
Right.
And of course, my chief nurse said to me, where are you going? I said, I really don't know. I'm going to get on the train and go somewhere. And she said, well, don't you think that's a little not the thing to do?
Right.
And
right.
I said,
but
well,
you wanted to see the country, right?
I said, well, I may never get a chance to be in England again, so I'm going everywhere I possibly can. And so she didn't fuss and fume too much after that. She sort of let me go.
Right.
But I had to have permission from her to go on these weekend trips.
Right. I know one of your problems that you had is you had a roommate that had a little bit of a drinking problem, you said, so you didn't want to hang around a whole lot. Plus, you wanted to, this would be your only chance to see the country of England.
Yes,
so
I had a roommate that really was an alcoholic.
Right.
And there's no ifs and ands about it. And I really didn't want to spend a weekend with her.
Exactly.
And so for that reason, I got every weekend I possibly could.
Right, right. So much of your time in England, and this is very important that I don't think a lot of people realize, so much of your time in England was spent preparing for what you were going to do, and that was to go over
After D-Day.
Right, to go
Yes.
after D-Day and to take care of the wounded and the soldiers. And a lot of that was preparing the supplies, how they would have to go, because you don't just create a hospital. You don't just get there and the hospital's all ready to go. You all had to build it from the bottom up.
We had to make sure that we had everything that we possibly could think of that we would put in this trunk, so that we couldn't go to the corner store and say, well, give me a bandage.
Right, right.
And so
right.
this was the reason that we did it.
Yeah.
And we tried to think of things that we could possibly run out of, that we didn't want to run out of. And so we did this for a long time, which was very nice. And so we had a good time doing it. All of us did it at one time.
First thing you think about, I guess, is bandages. Okay, that's easy. Bandages, your medical supplies. But I mean, what other? When you're building a hospital from the ground up, what other kind of things you put in that trunk?
You have to have slings for broken arms, and for head wounds, you have to have compressed bandages that are different than just ordinary bandages, and then you have to have a lot of compressed bandages, which you could wrap around wounded that would keep them together.
Right.
And at that time being, they didn't have the supplies that they have now. You had to sort of make up your bandages so that you would have that for certain wounds. So that's what kept us going.
Right, right, right. And you had to get this all compact and ready to go. So a lot of your time was spent doing that. And then you did go overseas and you landed. Talk about where you landed. You landed in a very famous place in World War II, just beyond
Utah
the
Beach.
beaches. Right, Utah Beach.
Yes. And I went back there 50 years later and found this place exactly where I landed.
As a matter of fact, we've got coming up later in the show a photograph that I found in your book of you at Utah Beach 50 years later. Landed at Utah Beach, and the first town that you actually set up shop in was St. Mary Glees.
Well, outside of there.
Outside of there.
But at St. Mary Glees. And we spent the first night in the graveyard.
Talk about, and the reason you did it outside, because you were explaining to me the churches. There were the churches there you could have spent the night in, but they were very, very cold. It was warmer to be outside.
They were colder in the churches than they were outside by the tombstones.
Right.
And there wasn't anyone going to bother us.
Yeah.
Right.
So you spent the first night in a cemetery.
Yes.
Did you get a lot of sleep that night?
Oh, yes. It didn't bother us.
No one was going to bother you,
No,
right?
that's right. It didn't bother us.
That's right. This was just a few weeks, July the 15th, 1944, just a few weeks after D-Day, and you were, like I said, you were sleeping on the grass. What sort of characterized what France was like at that time, a month after D-Day? I guess most of the fighting had gone inland, right?
Well, a month after D-Day, they were only about 20 miles in.
Right.
So actually, the Germans were 20 miles away from where we were. So we weren't that far into France.
Right.
And it was very touch and go at times.
Right. You could hear the bombing.
Well, they bombed St. Lo, and their bombs didn't accurately bomb St. Lo exactly where they should have.
Right.
And the bombs were about a mile away from us.
Yes. Yeah. There are some humorous times in your experience in the war. One time, I think you said you were at Utah Beach. You were coming back from a function or an event, and you had a little accident going from boat to boat. Is that right?
I fell between them. That's something you don't want to do.
No.
But I did fall between these two boats, and fortunately, I had presence of mind because I have grown up on Lake Erie, and it didn't bother me. And I thought, well, they have to have something hanging on the side of this boat. You know, I've seen boats out there, and I knew they had a lot of wires and so forth, and I reached out, and I got into the water just up to my waist. And of course, the sailors there said, "Where are you?" And I said, "Down here." And they said, where? I said, down here. And they said, well, you can climb up. I said, no way. I said, you're going to come down and get me. I am not climbing up anywhere.
Right.
So they came down and got me. Yeah, I just was wet. But otherwise than that, I was in good shape.
Yolanda, the 100th Evacuation Hospital was a unit attached to Patton's
Patton's
3rd Army. And you did have occasion to meet General Patton, obviously probably one of the most famous and recognizable figures of all of American history. He was a rough old bird, just like he's characterized in the history books, right?
Yes, he was, but he knew warfare,
Mm-hmm.
and he knew exactly where to go and what to do about it, and he did. He planned extremely well.
Right.
He was probably one of the best people that we ever had in war,
Mm-hmm.
that planned accordingly to what was necessary.
Right, right.
And he was a very rough man,
Uh-huh.
but I think he was a very good man.
Right. He was fair.
Yes.
Sometimes not nice.
Not nice, but he
you-
was fair.
That's right.
Right.
But you can't lead an
No.
army and be nice. That's right. Your hospitals, the 100th evacuation, sort of characterized that. I know there was surgery, there was medical, there was also psychiatric care, and you were a triage nurse.
Yes.
So sort of give us an idea of what these particular moving hospitals were like and what your particular job was.
Well, being a triage nurse, you have to define whether or not this person is acutely ill,
Mm-hmm.
or whether he needs surgery immediately, or whether he can go back to combat.
Mm-hmm.
And what you do as a triage nurse, the people that can go back to combat are treated first,
Right, right.
which is very difficult.
Which is very difficult sometimes, because sometimes you had to treat the less severely wounded because
Then-
they could get on their feet quicker and go back to combat,
That-
and sometimes the more severely wounded had to
Wait. And you tried to save as many seriously wounded as you possibly could.
Right,
But your hands were tied in many ways because you only had so much space in a tent, and you only had 2 people attending these people.
Right.
And that probably was about for 60 people.
mm-hmm.
And sometimes you couldn't do everything that you really wanted to do.
Right,
I mean, you did the best that you could, and you tried as hard as you could.
right. I want to go to some pictures now that you supplied to us. You keep an album of your experience in World War II, and we've got some of the pictures that Yolanda has given to us, and you can see them right there on the screen. That is a picture that I found of a young Yolanda Frisch. About how old were you in that picture?
25.
25 years old. And that was taken when? Before you went overseas?
That
or do
probably
you
was,
recall?
no, that was taken in England.
In England.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Let's move on. What are we looking at there?
This
You're on the
was-
left, obviously.
Yes, this was in, well, I have to laugh at it because this was someone that just came in and had a slight wound, and we were treating him, and this photographer took this picture of that, and that was it.
Yeah.
It was one of those kind of things that you said, well, I don't really need this.
By the looks on the faces, it doesn't look like a real serious situation. right there.
It was not
Yeah,
a
he
serious
was-
situation at all.
That was one of those that you just bandaged up and said, get on back out there. So
Yeah, we said, you're done, go.
you're done, go. Okay. Let's move on to the next picture. It's of
Oh, this was Christmas. And this-
1944.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and that's Greenberg. That was one of my tent mates.
Right.
And we all made snowmen. We thought, why not celebrate?
Uh-huh.
And we got through making all these snowmen and so forth, and we moved the day before Christmas.
I see. People when they talk about the Battle of the Bulge, which was this time, they talk about how cold it was. So there's sort of an
It was
idea
cold.
of
We had
what
a-
the terrain was like.
We had a pot-bellied stove in each tent,
Right.
and we were allowed 1 brick a week.
Uh-huh.
And 1 brick a week, which was 4 bricks for us.
Right.
And we would save it all at one time and make fudge.
Oh, okay.
Well,
That's resourceful. Okay.
That's right.
Let's move on to the next picture.
oh, this is Greenberg and I were rolling up our
Your
sleeping bag, yeah.
Mhm.
And of course, with your sleeping bag, it was your luggage, it was everything that you had. Everything that you had, you put in your sleeping bag.
Right.
And they look at them and they say, they're big. And I said, well, we had to put all our clothes in there, all our shoes, everything else went in there. So that's why they were not a small bag.
No.
I still have one.
It was a 2-person job to roll
Yeah.
that up, obviously.
Yeah, I still have mine.
That's right. Well, y'all were having fun. You still have that.
Yes.
Oh, goodness. What are we looking at there?
Roses that somebody gave me.
We won't have to say who. Your husband's here at the taping, so we'll
He's seen it before.
He's seen it before. He's seen it before.
Right.
Okay. I just thought that was a very good picture. Roses in front of the tent.
Right.
Okay, now we hadn't talked about this yet, but towards the end of your time, you were actually invited to a party that was thrown by the Russians. And you went across the Elbe River to this party that was thrown by the Russians. And the one thing that you're going to tell me is that in that picture, you're about the only sober one in that picture. Is that right?
That's right.
Uh-huh.
I'm the only sober one in that picture. I mean, when I got there, the Russians had a very nice dinner, and of course they served vodka. And I sat next to a Russian lieutenant colonel.
Right.
And of course, when they said Prost, everyone was supposed to drink the vodka, you know, and then they'd refill it and refill it. And I looked at him and I said, "What would your wife do?" And he looked at me and he said, "Well, she wouldn't drink it." And I said, "Thank you very much."
So you were the designated driver of that party, right there.
Well, yes, I was the designated driver, is right.
Okay, let's move on. I like this picture. You're the second from the left
Yes.
in this picture, and so you all were putting on a little show. Is that right?
Well, Colonel sort of got bored with what we were doing, and he decided that we should have a show. So he assigned a lieutenant who had experience putting on shows like this, which I didn't know, and he was from New York, so he put this show together, and we had a good time. And we had a real good time.
And those are all nurses. Those
All
are also
nurses.
Your former
They're
nurses.
all
And
nurses.
And you're the second one from the left.
Right.
Where'd you get the dresses?
At a costume place
Just at
in
a costume
Liverpool.
place in Liverpool.
Yeah.
Okay. That's wonderful. Okay. Here's the picture that we talked about.
Yes.
This was, I guess, taken in, 1995?
Yes.
And you went back. Talk about your visit back to Utah Beach.
Oh. Well,
I know it was 12 years ago.
Yeah,
it
but
didn't seem like that long
well,
ago. Well,
no, what I thought about more than anything else is it was such a clean beach.
Right.
And when we landed, there was so much trash on the beach that you could barely walk between everything that was there. And this was so clean, I looked at it and said, I didn't know there was sand there.
Yeah.
But it brought back, you know, we went from an LCI to an LST, which landed us there. And these are things that people don't realize. And we climbed down rope ladders from the ship. And this is another thing. I guess with the excitement and everything that went on, I almost fainted, and my roommate helped me down the rope ladder.
Oh my goodness.
I mean, I think it was just the excitement and everything else.
Right.
But we got down it. But we had to climb down these rope ladders from the ship.
Right.
And that's not an easy thing to do.
Exactly. You told me, just to give people an idea of the enormity of what your job and the responsibility of this 100th evac hospital was. You said that normally you would get in 300 to 400 a day, but sometimes you were even known to get 1,000 a day in the hospital.
That's right. That's overwhelming.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
And we only worked 8 hours a day because our colonel said that after 8 hours you were not efficient.
Right.
And he felt that if we worked the 8 hours that we were much more efficient at taking care of things. And you have no idea of the depth of caring that went on. I mean, it seems like, you know, you look at us and you think, well, you took care of those things, but the caring that we had inside didn't show, because as nurses you don't do it.
Right. You eventually went into Germany, about 20 miles from Berlin, set up shop there, and you talked about actually being strafed there because
Oh, yes, we were.
War wasn't nice. That red cross sign on the top
It
of
only
tents.
meant an invitation.
That's right.
It only meant an invitation.
That's right. It didn't mean that it was a safe haven. Sometimes that meant you were a target.
Right, and I did find bullets in my head. So they did strafe the tent.
That'll get your attention.
Oh yeah, it does in a hurry.
Absolutely, yes. After the war was over, this was something that kind of rubbed you the wrong way. After the war was over, the men were sent home, but they forgot about 8,000 nurses. They thought had been sent home, but you weren't. You were still there.
Yes, in Reims, France. 8,000 of us, and believe me, when you have 10 weeks
Right.
that we were there, all of us, just women, you get a little tired.
Exactly. Uh-huh.
So we finally yelled loud enough that somebody from headquarters came down and said, "Oh, you are all supposed to be home."
Uh-huh.
And we said, "Well, then what are we doing here?"
Right.
So he sent us home.
Finally sent you home.
Yeah.
But you got an extra 8-week tour, 8 to 10 week tour there
Yes.
before you
Which
got
we
sent
didn't
home.
want.
Right. Yolanda, you talked about the horrors of war, which obviously you saw as a triage nurse, but during the time after the near war's end, you came in contact with some concentration camps, and you saw some things obviously that you'll never forget.
Yes. After the war was over, of course, the liberation of the concentration camps, we took care of the ones that were there. But what I remember more than anything else, and it still bothers me, is that the smell of burnt flesh.
Mm-hmm.
And when I smell burnt meat and so forth, it triggers that memory.
Mm-hmm.
And you see these people, and when you think that you've got a room 8 by 10 stacked with bodies, I mean, you don't forget this.
No.
And you see these people that hung on, finally to be liberated.
And you talked about one time about actually being on a road and just seeing soldier after soldier after soldier walking the other way. They were walking hundreds of miles to get home.
Well, these people were from Slovenia
Mm-hmm.
and Croatia.
Right.
And they had been slaves of the Nazis working in factories, and they were on their way home.
Right.
And they thought nothing of it. I mean, they were ready to go. And they just lived off the land as much as they could.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I want to switch gears and talk about a happier subject. We talked about how you met this aviator, Ed
Mm-hmm.
Kozlowski, 4 days after D-Day.
Mm-hmm.
You all met each other. You went to a party, I believe, and kind of got to know each other. And you agreed that y'all would write back and forth, and you did, but you actually didn't see each other again until back in the States after the war was over, right?
We did not see each other until after the war was over.
Right.
And then I wrote Ed
Uh-huh.
during spring break at the university he was attending and said, "How about letting me come up and see you?" And of course my mother and father are going. I said, "I'm 25 years old. I can go where I want to go." And so I went to see him.
Right.
And we decided that we liked each other, and we carried on a correspondence. And then I went to Milwaukee and applied for a job at the VA hospital,
Right.
which they hired me. And we decided we would get married, but I said I would wait 1 year before I would marry Ed because I felt that we needed to know each other. And we waited a year and got married.
How logical of you. That's just
Right.
And that was in August of 1947.
Seven.
So in
Right.
this year, 2007, you all are celebrating your 60th anniversary.
So it worked out.
It evidently worked out pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
It really did. Talk about you and Ed and your careers after the war. You continued to nurse and how you all eventually got down to College Station, and both of you working for Texas A&M.
Well, Ed finished his degree at Marquette University, and then he was hired by, can't remember. But anyways, Republic Steel
Right.
in Cleveland,
Okay.
Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
And so we went to Cleveland to live and bought a house in Euclid. And then that didn't work out quite what he wanted to do. Then he went to work for Sherwin-Williams.
Right.
And he worked there for a number of years, and he had the opportunity to do something else, and then he was in between looking for a job and trying to figure out where we really wanted to be, and there was a ad, and I think it was in the Wall Street Journal,
Mm-hmm.
and it was for Texas A&M
I see.
as a in charge of maintenance for the Texas A&M University.
Right, like physical plant. type
And
thing.
I said, "Why don't you apply?" And he said, "Oh, I'd never get hired." And I said, "How do you know?" I said, "Go ahead and apply." He did, and he got hired.
Right.
And so that led to me coming down to Texas A&M. And then I applied at the employment office, and the first thing they said to me is, "Do you type?"
Uh-huh.
And I looked at him and I said, "I don't think I'd ask that to everybody that came in here." And they said, "Why not?" And I said, "For the very simple reason, not everybody types."
Right.
I said, "And besides, I have an RN, which I don't have to type. And so anyway, I applied for a job and or position, and they said to me, well, you can work at the, I was going to say Quack Shack, but you know what I'm talking about. And so I went there and I interviewed, and this woman who interviewed me gave me the feeling that she really didn't want me there. Mm-hmm. And I'm going, well, why should I work somewhere where I'm really not wanted?
Right.
So I came back and I said, well, that's not exactly what I want to do. And they told me that they had an opening at the veterinary school.
Right.
And I said, well, let's go see what it is. So I went and I applied and I got it. And the man who hired me said, how many years are you going to stay? And I said, 10 years. He looked at me and he said, 10 years? And I said, yes, I will stay 10 years. Because at that time I was 57 years old, and I figured that by the time I got to be 67, I should be retiring.
Right.
And so he employed me, and I went to work for the veterinary school, and I did experimental surgery and research.
Right. And you were there, woman of your word, and you were there 10 years and you retired. There's so much more that we could talk about, but we're out of time. You and Ed have a daughter and you have 2 grandchildren. I know you're very proud of all of them. But thank you very much for your service, Yolanda, and thank you for being our guest today.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
All right. Yolanda Kozlowski is a woman of determination and skill. And the war was won because of soldiers like her, soldiers who saved the lives of other soldiers and thus allowed generations of families to grow. We salute Captain Yolanda Frisch Kozlowski for her service, as we do all veterans. I'm Tom Turbeville. Please join us next time on Veterans of the Valley.
In honor of the veterans who have served our country, both past and present, First